You are a royal physician in the labyrinthine palace of Madrid. The year is 1834. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and grief, clings to you like a shroud. The king is dead, but your work, the most grotesque work of your life, has just begun. You have been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII, a room that has been a silent witness to decades of suffering. The new Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands before you. Her face is a mask of strained composure, her eyes shadowed not just by loss, but by the weight of a terrible secret. Her request, delivered in a whisper that barely cuts through the oppressive silence, is so bizarre, so unprecedented, that you feel the foundations of your medical reason begin to crack. You are not here for a standard autopsy, not to determine the cause of death, that was plain enough. You are here to perform a singular, focused preservation. Your hands, usually so steady with a scalpel, tremble as you approach the magnificent bed where Ferdinand's body lies. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to possess a malevolent energy, a sneer frozen on his waxen lips. But it is not his face that commands your attention. It is the form concealed beneath the heavy silk sheets. The Thing. The anatomical monstrosity that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. The curse that historians would whisper about for centuries, but never dare to commit to their official accounts. Ferdinand VII's 7th member. His grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment, the simultaneous source of his deepest, most corrosive shame and his most twisted, tyrannical pride. As you prepare your instruments, your mind retreats from the grim task at hand, wandering through the shadowed corridors of the palace's memory. You think of the stories, the hushed rumors that were the true currency of this court, stories of custom-made cushions with strategic hollows, of the terrified screams of teenage wives echoing through stone walls, of desperate alchemical attempts to produce an air against the cruel joke of nature itself. In this moment, you understand with chilling clarity that you are not just preserving flesh and blood. You are preserving a metaphor. You are embalming the physical symbol of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately lethally destructive to everything and everyone it touched. You reflect on the grim philosophy of your profession in this place. A king's body is never his own. It is an extension of the state, a vessel for the dynasty, and as you gaze upon the source of Ferdinand's curse, you realize you are looking at the diseased, pathological core of the Spanish state itself. This is the story of how the most intimate secret of a king became the defining curse of a nation. It is the story of how a single man's physical dysfunction metastasized into political tyranny, civil war, and the final gasping collapse of an empire. To comprehend the tragedy of Ferdinand VII, one must first understand that he was born condemned, not by a witch's hex or by divine wrath, but by a far more patient and insidious poison, the legacy of his own blood. For centuries, the royal houses of Europe, and none more so than the Spanish Habsburgs and their Bourbon successors, had engaged in a systematic program of self-contamination. To preserve power and property within the family, they had turned their own genealogical tree into a tangled, suffocating knot. They married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, weaving a genetic tapestry so tight that its threads began to fray and snap. With each generation, the risk of disaster grew, until the royal womb became a lottery, where the only prize was a new and more pronounced form of decay. This was a dynasty visibly crumbling from within. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite that made it difficult for monarchs to eat or speak, was merely the most famous symptom of a deeper rot. Hemophilia, epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and profound mental instability stalked the royal family like inherited ghosts. This physical decay was a sickeningly perfect mirror for the state of the Spanish Empire itself. Once a global colossus upon which the sun never set, Spain was now a shadow of its former self, its colonies restless, its treasury depleted, its political body racked with sclerosis. Ferdinand was to be the living embodiment of this dual decline, a king whose body was a microcosm of his broken kingdom. He was born at the imposing, tomb-like palace of El Escorial on October 14, 1784, the product of a union between King Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, who were themselves first cousins. From the moment he drew breath, the genetic dice were loaded against him. But it was in the privacy of his own development that nature would play its most personal and cruelest joke. As he grew from a pale, watchful boy into a sullen adolescent, it became terrifyingly clear to his physicians that the future King of Spain was developing in a way that defied medical understanding, in a way that was fundamentally monstrously wrong. His member, the very symbol of his dynastic duty and masculine authority, began to grow, and grow, and grow. It developed not with the symmetry of nature, but with the chaotic energy of a tumor. By his teenage years, the court was already a viper's nest of whispers about the royal anomaly. Physicians, in their secret correspondence, struggled to find the clinical language to describe it. One, writing to a colleague in Rome, called it a monstrosity of flesh. Another was more graphically descriptive. The prince's organ, he wrote in a letter later hidden in the Vatican archives, resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and of a length that serves no natural purpose. The official term for his condition, later theorized by medical historians, was macropenis and corporal disproportion, a perfect storm of hormonal and genetic misfirings. The psychological impact on the young Ferdinand was catastrophic. In an era where male anatomy was judged by classical Greek ideals, where smaller was seen as more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive misshapen organ marked him as a grotesque. The very thing that was supposed to guarantee his lineage became the source of his deepest shame. This private horror was compounded by a very public humiliation. His father, Charles IV, was a weak, indecisive ruler who preferred the thrill of the hunt to the duties of the throne. The real power in Spain was wielded by his mother, Queen Maria Louisa, and her brazenly open lover, the handsome and ambitious chief minister, Manuel de Godoy. Young Ferdinand was forced to watch this daily spectacle of his father's cuckolding. He saw the smirks of the courtiers, heard the gossip of the servants. He saw his own father rendered impotent, not physically but politically and socially. This created in Ferdinand a foundational crisis of masculine identity. He felt unmanned by his father's weakness and his mother's power, a feeling of profound inadequacy that was then monstrously amplified and confirmed by the shameful secret he harbored beneath his own clothes. His deformity was not just a physical problem. It was the physical manifestation of the humiliation that defined his youth. This crucible of shame and resentment forged not a king, but a tyrant. Humiliation became the lens through which he saw the world. He began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia was not entirely unfounded. People were laughing at him, but his reaction was always disproportionate, venomous. He became secretive, vindictive, and breathtakingly cruel to those beneath him. He was learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt over his own body. A chilling incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness congealing in his soul. A young page, no older than 12, accidentally walked in on the prince while he was changing. The boy caught only a fleeting glimpse of the royal shame, before stammering an apology and fleeing. Ferdinand did not simply dismiss him. He had the boy publicly flogged until his back was a ruin of blood and flesh, and then had his entire family exiled from Madrid, their property seized by the crown. This was not mere punishment. It was a desperate pathological attempt to exert absolute control, to erase the witness to his vulnerability. He could not fix his body, but he could destroy the lives of those who saw it. It was the first time he had turned his private shame into public suffering, a pattern that would come to define his reign. As he reached marriageable age, the full, terrifying scope of his anatomical challenge became a matter of state. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature, and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications were dire. Normal intimate relations would be a physical impossibility. More than that, they would be an act of grievous bodily harm. The royal workshops were secretly commissioned to create what were euphemistically termed marital aids, specially designed cushions with hollows and channels, supportive harnesses, and a variety of salves and oils. But these mechanical solutions could not address the psychological chasm. Ferdinand became obsessed with potions and elixirs, spending a fortune on court alchemists and foreign quacks who promised miracle cures. He consumed foul-smelling mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs, all meant to regulate his royal essence. Some potions claimed they would shrink his member. Others claimed they would enhance its fertility, despite its shape. All of them failed, leaving him ever more desperate, ever more convinced that he was a freak of nature, a king cursed in the one place a king could not afford to be. He was a man drowning in shame, and he was about to drag his first innocent victim down with him. In 1802, the machinery of dynastic survival cranked into motion. A bride was chosen for Ferdinand, his first cousin, the 18-year-old Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. She was, by all accounts, a perfect candidate, beautiful, intelligent, and from a suitably Catholic royal house. But she was more than just a naive girl. Raised in the politically turbulent court of Naples, a kingdom constantly caught between the ambitions of France and the naval power of Britain, Maria Antonia was politically astute. Her mother, the formidable Queen Maria Carolina, had instilled in her a sense of duty and ambition. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid not just as a bride but as a political player, hoping to strengthen the alliance between Spain and Naples and steer the weak Spanish court away from the growing influence of Napoleon Bonaparte. She had heard the propaganda spread by Ferdinand's supporters, who called him El Deseado, the desired one. She imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince who would help her secure her family's political future. She could not have known she was being led to a sacrificial altar. The wedding ceremony was a masterpiece of royal theatre. The cathedral swelled with the sound of organs and choirs, the streets of Madrid echoed with staged celebrations, and the young couple looked every inch the perfect royal pair. Ferdinand, a master of public deception, played the part of the charming, attentive fiancé. But as day turned to night, the facade began to crumble. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia as ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber. A collection of custom-made cushions, strange bottles of oils, and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic were brought in. Maria Antonia, whose education had focused on languages, music, and courtly etiquette, understood none of it. The facts of married life had been explained to her in the vaguest of terms by nervous older women. She was utterly unprepared for the specific, monstrous reality that awaited her. When Ferdinand finally entered the bridal chamber and disrobed, Maria Antonia's world shattered. Her first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into violent hysterics. One of her ladies-in-waiting, writing years later in a secret memoir, described the scene with horror. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. The sheer size of Ferdinand's member terrified her, but it was the bizarre, unnatural shape, the way it curved, the strange growths, the grotesque disproportion that truly broke her mind. What followed was not a wedding night, but a clinical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified, sobbing princess what was required of her. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils were applied. She was given a heavy dose of laudanum, an opium tincture, to render her compliant. The process that followed was an ordeal of pain and violation, more akin to a crude surgery than an act of love. Ferdinand, already pathologically insecure, reacted to his wife's obvious revulsion with a cold, simmering rage. Her terror was a mirror to his own shame, and he hated her for it. Maria Antonia, for her part, developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe sexual trauma. She began to rely on larger and larger doses of laudanum, becoming an addict to escape the ritualized nightmare of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a recurring horror show. Creative 30%. The failure was not just a private sorrow, it became a public political crisis. At court, factions began to weaponize the couple's infertility. The party loyal to the chief minister, Godoy, spread malicious rumors that Maria Antonia was barren, or worse, that she was deliberately avoiding conception to spite the Spanish crown. The pro-French faction, eager to see the Bourbon line weakened, circulated exaggerated tales of Ferdinand's condition in the courts of Europe, painting him as an impotent laughingstock. The royal bedroom, the supposed source of the nation's future, had become the epicenter of its political instability. Maria Antonia, trapped and terrified, found herself isolated, her political ambitions turning to dust. Her only value was in her womb, and her womb remained empty. Ferdinand, consumed by desperation, grew more monstrous. Convinced that his wife's disgust was somehow preventing conception, he ordered the creation of special restraints, contraptions of leather and silk, crafted by the same artisans who made his hunting saddles, to hold Maria Antonia in position, preventing her from flinching or pulling away. He consulted astrologers, mystics, and charlatans, timing their traumatic encounters to lunar cycles and planetary alignments. For 3 months, he and his drugged wife were subjected to bizarre rituals prescribed by a wandering mystic who claimed Ferdinand was blessed with the dragon's rod and needed only the proper ceremonies to unlock its power. Then, a miracle. In 1804, Maria Antonia became pregnant. The court rejoiced. Ferdinand was ecstatic, his fragile ego momentarily restored. But the hope was short-lived. The pregnancy ended in a devastating miscarriage in the 4th month. Court physicians, in their coded language, attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. What they meant was that the recurring trauma of intercourse with Ferdinand was so severe that her body could not sustain a pregnancy. A year later it happened again. This time she carried the child almost to term before losing it in a labor so bloody and violent that it nearly killed her. The Queen never recovered. Her spirit was broken, her body ravaged, her mind clouded by a constant fog of laudanum. She was a ghost haunting the palace halls. Ferdinand's reaction to these losses revealed the true depth of his depravity. He showed no compassion. Instead, he accused her of deliberately killing his heirs, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic king. These accusations, whispered by a man consumed by his own inadequacy, destroyed what little remained of her sanity. She died in May 1806, at the age of only 21. The official cause was a fever, but the truth was far darker. She died of despair, her body and mind systematically dismantled by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological torture. Even in death, she was not safe from his paranoia. Rumors, likely started by Ferdinand himself, began to circulate that she had been poisoned. The palace apothecary was found dead in his chambers days later, a cryptic letter he had written seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. This act was a chilling masterstroke of political manipulation, likely influenced by the pro-French faction who saw an opportunity. By creating a murder mystery, Ferdinand shifted blame from his own monstrous inadequacy. He was not the king whose deformity killed his wife. He was the tragic victim whose beloved queen was struck down by assassins. It was a lie that allowed him to begin searching for a new wife, a new womb, almost immediately, his public grief a carefully constructed performance to mask a monstrous relief. The first martyr was dead, but Ferdinand's reign of intimate terror was just beginning. With his first wife in her tomb, Ferdinand's attention turned from the failures of the bedroom to the intrigues of the court. His personal humiliation had festered into a potent political ambition, one driven not by a desire to govern, but by a ravenous hunger to depose his mother's lover, Manuel Godoy, and seize the absolute power he felt was his birthright. He became the center of a conspiracy of disgruntled nobles who saw him as their puppet, a vehicle to overthrow the weak government. They cleverly branded him El Deseado, the desired one, crafting a public image of a wise, patriotic prince who would restore Spain to glory. They had no idea they were allying themselves with a man whose personality had been warped into something profoundly dangerous by his secret shame. The conspiracy culminated in 1807, when Ferdinand was caught plotting to overthrow his own father with the secret support of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand's true character was laid bare. He displayed no honor, no loyalty. He immediately betrayed every single one of his co-conspirators, providing detailed confessions and groveling for his parents' forgiveness. While his allies were imprisoned or exiled, Ferdinand escaped punishment. It was a defining moment, establishing the pattern for his entire life. Use people for your own ends, then destroy them the moment they become inconvenient. But a greater power was now at play. In 1808, Napoleon, seeing the dysfunction of the Spanish court, invaded Spain. He forced both Ferdinand and his father to abdicate, placing his own brother on the Spanish throne. Ferdinand was exiled to the Château de Valençay in France, a gilded cage where he would spend the next 6 years. It was another profound humiliation. He, the king, was now a prisoner, his shameful medical condition undoubtedly known to his captors through their extensive intelligence network. While Ferdinand languished in comfortable captivity, writing sycophantic letters to Napoleon, Spain erupted in fire and blood. The Spanish people, in the name of their absent and desired king, rose up against the French invaders. For 6 years they fought the brutal Peninsular War, a heroic guerrilla struggle that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And in the midst of this war, something extraordinary happened. In the besieged city of Cadiz, liberal reformers, nobles and intellectuals gathered. Believing they were acting on the future king's enlightened ideals, they drafted the Spanish Constitution of 1812. It was one of the most progressive and revolutionary documents of its age. It established a constitutional monarchy, declared the sovereignty of the nation, abolished the Inquisition, and guaranteed freedom of the press and universal male suffrage. It was a beacon of hope, a vision of a new modern Spain rising from the ashes of war, ready to take its place among the enlightened nations of Europe. The men who wrote it, the heroes of the war who fought for it, they did it all for him, for El Deseado. They believed he would return and embrace this new dawn. In 1814, Napoleon was defeated, and Ferdinand returned to Spain. His homecoming was met with near religious ecstasy. Crowds wept, threw flowers, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed. They saw him not as a man, but as a savior, the living symbol of their victory and their hope for a constitutional future. This was Ferdinand's moment of destiny, his chance to heal a wounded nation and become the modern monarch his people prayed for. But to understand what happened next, one must return to the poisoned wellspring of his character. A man so defined by his physical inadequacy, so terrified of being seen as weak or ridiculous, so consumed by a paranoid need for absolute control to compensate for his powerlessness, such a man could never, ever accept a document that limited his authority. A constitution to Ferdinand was just another form of mockery. It was a set of rules imposed upon him, a public declaration that he was not absolute. It was a castration of his divine right to rule, an intolerable echo of the personal castration he felt every day of his life. His decision was swift and brutal. Upon arriving in Valencia, he was presented with the Constitution. He didn't just reject it. He issued a decree declaring it, and all the work of the Cadiz Cortes null and void. He tore up the promise of a modern Spain as if it were a love letter from a wife he despised. And then he unleashed a wave of terror that shocked Europe. He ordered the arrest of the very liberals who had written the Constitution in his name. The heroes of the resistance, the great thinkers and patriots, were rounded up, imprisoned, tortured, and executed. He reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, turning its cruel machinery on his own people. This was the great betrayal. It was not merely a political act, it was a profound act of psychological projection. He would inflict upon Spain the absolute, suffocating, cruel control that he could never have over his own body. He would make his kingdom suffer for his own shame. The cheers of the crowds died in their throats, replaced by the screams from the dungeons. The desired one had revealed himself to be a monster, and his reign of public terror, a perfect mirror of his private one, had just begun. Ferdinand's return marked the beginning of what Spanish historians call the Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. It was a period of suffocating tyranny, where the king's personal pathologies and his political oppression became one and the same. And at the heart of this darkness was his renewed frantic obsession with producing an heir. The nation needed a future, but the king, first and foremost, needed to prove his manhood. His first act was not to reform the government or rebuild the war-torn country, but to commission an entirely new set of marital aids from the finest, most discreet craftsmen in Europe. Then he chose his second wife. In 1816 he married another cousin, the 19-year-old Maria Isabel of Portugal. Like Maria Antonia before her, she arrived full of naive hope, only to have it brutally extinguished on her wedding night. The screams that echoed through the palace that night were said to be even more terrible than the first time. The cycle of horror began anew. The trauma, the medical interventions, the laudanum. This private nightmare unfolded against a backdrop of national catastrophe. As Ferdinand brutalized his new wife in a fruitless quest for an heir, his empire was dying. One by one, the colonies of Latin America, the source of Spain's wealth and prestige for 3 centuries, were declaring and winning their independence. There is a terrible, tragic symmetry here. In the royal palace, a king was proving himself impotent, unable to plant his seed and secure his own lineage. Across the ocean, his empire was proving equally impotent, unable to hold on to its own children who were breaking away to form new nations. Ferdinand's personal sexual failure became a grand metaphor for Spain's imperial collapse. The king who could not control his own body could not control his own empire. Maria Isabel never recovered from the trauma. She developed a pronounced stutter and what physicians called hysterical episodes, which were clearly severe panic attacks. In 1817 she became pregnant, but the child, a daughter, lived for only 4 months. The following year, during another difficult pregnancy, she died in childbirth along with the infant. Ferdinand's reaction was cold and immediate. His only concern was finding a third wife. The search proved difficult. Ferdinand's reputation as a monstrous husband was now legendary in the courts of Europe. Eventually, his agents found a family desperate enough to overlook the danger. The Saxons. In 1819, he married Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. She was 24, older and more worldly than her predecessors. She had been thoroughly briefed on the king's peculiarities and approached the marriage not as a romance, but as a clinical scientific challenge. She arrived in Madrid with her own physician and her own collection of medical devices. The clinical coldness of this third marriage perfectly mirrored the political climate of the ominous decade. As Maria Josefa and Ferdinand engaged in their scheduled, medically supervised and loveless attempts at procreation, the king unleashed a cold, bureaucratic terror upon Spain. He had restored the Inquisition, and now he used it to hunt down anyone with liberal ideas. Universities were purged of free-thinking professors. Books were burned. Secret societies and Masonic lodges were brutally suppressed. Spies were everywhere. The warm passion of the Spanish resistance had been replaced by the cold, dead hand of absolutist reaction. The royal bedchamber, now a laboratory of sexual dysfunction, was a microcosm of the nation itself, a place devoid of life, passion, or hope, where a sterile procedure was repeated over and over with no result but suffering. Maria Josefa, the clinical queen, was the perfect bride for a Spain being systematically bled of its vitality. For 10 years, this grim charade continued. Maria Josefa, with the detached precision of a research scientist, kept detailed records of their attempts, noting techniques and outcomes. This clinical detachment seemed to enrage Ferdinand even more than his previous wife's terror. He suspected she was mocking him, documenting his failure for foreign eyes. Then, in 1829, the impossible happened. Maria Josefa was pregnant. The court was stunned. Ferdinand was seized by a manic mix of euphoria and terror. He placed his wife under what amounted to house arrest, surrounded by guards and a legion of physicians. But his interference proved fatal. He insisted on consulting mystics and alchemists alongside doctors, creating chaos. In the 7th month, complications arose. On May 18th, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The delivery was a horror. The baby, a girl, lived for only a few hours. Maria Josepha, weakened and heartbroken, succumbed to an infection 3 weeks later. Ferdinand's mind finally, completely snapped. He refused to allow either body to be buried, keeping the corpses in the palace for nearly a week, while he demanded his physicians perform resurrections. The stench of decay filled the royal apartments. When he was finally forced to accept reality, he collapsed into a profound depression, a living ghost haunting a palace of ghosts, surrounded by the death masks of the 3 wives he had systematically destroyed. He was a king of a crumbling empire, a widower 3 times over, and still, after all this bloodshed and suffering, utterly heirless. The ominous decade had ended, not with a bang, but with the smell of death and the silence of absolute failure. By 1829, King Ferdinand VII was 45 years old, a broken man ruling a broken kingdom. His body was a prison, his palace a mausoleum, his legacy a gaping void. His advisers, desperate to secure the succession and prevent a civil war upon his death, convinced him to marry one last time. The bride they found was his niece, Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies. The negotiations were concluded with unusual speed. There was a reason for the haste, a secret so audacious that it would redefine the Spanish monarchy. When Maria Cristina arrived in Madrid for the wedding, she was already pregnant, and the child was not Ferdinand's. The wedding was a farce that fooled no one in the inner circle of the court. Maria Cristina walked down the aisle, her pregnancy subtly visible, carrying the heir that Ferdinand had spent 3 marriages and countless lives failing to produce. But the king, in his bottomless desperation, embraced the deception. He publicly claimed the child as his own, perhaps even convincing himself that it was a divine miracle, an immaculate conception granted to reward his suffering. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Isabella. Ferdinand finally had his heir, but his triumph was a fraud, and his relief was poisoned by paranoia. His final years were a descent into a special kind of hell. He was a man trapped by his own lie. He had to champion a daughter he knew in his heart of hearts was not his. This contradiction ate away at what was left of his sanity. His paranoia, once focused on mockery of his condition, now fixated on the secret of Isabella's paternity. He became consumed with an impossible quest, to prove his fraudulent heir was legitimate while simultaneously terrorizing his wife, whom he suspected of constant betrayal. The palace devolved into a theater of the absurd, a madhouse directed by the king's shattered mind. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between his chambers and Maria Cristina's, spending hours with his eye pressed to the plaster, spying on her every move. Servants would see the royal eye bloodshot and wild, watching as the queen nursed her child, as she prayed, as she wrote letters. Maria Cristina lived in a glass cage, every breath monitored for treason. The food-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion. Tasters had to wait 30 minutes after each bite under the king's intense gaze, and several collapsed from sheer nervous exhaustion, which only confirmed Ferdinand's belief that assassination attempts were everywhere. He conducted midnight raids on his wife's chambers, bursting in with armed guards, searching for imaginary lovers and non-existent poisons. But the most devastating consequence of Ferdinand's lifelong failure was yet to come. It would not be psychological, but political, and it would drench Spain in blood for generations. According to Spanish tradition, based on Salic law, the throne could not pass to a woman if there were legitimate male relatives. Ferdinand's heir was, by this law, his younger, deeply conservative brother, Don Carlos. To ensure his illegitimate daughter Isabella would rule, Ferdinand had to do something drastic. In 1830, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, a royal decree that swept aside Salic law and allowed female succession. This single act, a direct and undeniable consequence of his sexual dysfunction, was the spark that lit a century-long fire. Don Carlos and his fiercely traditionalist supporters refused to accept it. They saw Isabella as illegitimate in every sense of the word, and the Pragmatic Sanction as an illegal violation of sacred tradition. The nation was split in two, the supporters of Isabella, known as the Cristinos or Liberals, and the supporters of Carlos, the Carlists. Ferdinand had, with the stroke of a pen, sowed the seeds of the Carlist Wars. These were not minor conflicts. They were a series of brutal, devastating civil wars that would tear Spain apart for the rest of the 19th century. Brother would fight brother, villages would be burned, and the political development of Spain would be crippled by decades of intractable conflict. All of it, every last drop of blood, could be traced back to the grotesque secret hidden in the king's bedchamber. His most private, personal failure was about to become Spain's most public, bloody, and enduring catastrophe. Ferdinand's health finally gave out under the immense strain. In his final days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a fever swamp of past and present horrors. He called out for his dead wives. He issued delirious orders to investigate plots that existed only in his head. He died on September 29, 1833. The official cause was gout, but the truth was simpler. He had died of exhaustion. A lifetime of shame, frustration, paranoia, and cruelty had finally consumed him. And so we return to you, the physician, in that quiet, suffocating room in 1834. Your grim task is complete. Before you, preserved in a jar of alcohol, is the source of it all, the physical evidence of a reign that had consumed everything it touched. The king's member, which a secret autopsy would confirm, measured a staggering 14 inches and was riddled with deformities. And even evidence of pathetic attempts at self-surgery rests in its glass tomb. It is a monument of flesh. It will be sealed in a crate, destined for the secret archives of the Vatican, deemed too disturbing, too politically volatile for the world to see. In this moment you grasp the terrible final thesis of Ferdinand's life. His grotesque anatomy was not a random curse. It was the perfect physical metaphor for the political system he represented. Absolutist monarchy in the 19th century had itself become a deformed, inbred, and unnatural thing. It was a dying political species, increasingly incapable of producing a healthy, legitimate future, in a world awakening to ideas of liberty and national sovereignty. Ferdinand's body was simply the external manifestation of that rotten political core. He was not an anomaly. He was the inevitable product of a sick system. You look from the jar to the grand window, out at a Spain already beginning to fracture. Just days after the king's death, his brother Don Carlos declared himself the rightful king, and the First Carlist War erupted. The seeds of civil war, sown by Ferdinand's sterile seed, had begun to sprout. The preserved organ you have just prepared is more than a medical curiosity. It is a testament to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic principle that the deepest secrets of those in power will inevitably, violently, carve themselves into the body of the nation. Ferdinand VII finally found peace in death, but he left behind a kingdom that would not know peace for 100 years. The most perverted king in history had ended as he had lived, as a source of suffering for everyone unfortunate enough to be touched by his tragic, deformed, and absolute power.